I'm Mark Bentham. I'm still Mark Bentham, still here, still acting.
And I'm Graham Nichols, very much concentrating and in focus.
I'm really glad, and I am Katie Holloway. You're listening to Ordinary. Hello, how are you both?
I am good, thank you.
I'm all right.
Good. Glad we got that out of the way.
Are you okay?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I am all right. Thanks.
Good.
Yeah. I spent my morning folding little tiny baby clothes. My friend's having twins, and we all gathered round to eat some cake and help her sort through her things. So
I saw 2 pairs of twins today. I was helping by taking some twins, and another 2 little girls walked past me, and I realised they were twins as well. So you had 4 twins. Yeah,
it's quite twinny around our area.
Well, there you go. Is that a word? Twinny.
Very twinny.
All good.
Yeah, nice.
Okay.
There we go. Have either of you, just by way of banter to ask you something more interesting, have you read or listened to or watched anything good lately you want to tell us about? I did tell you in advance I was going to ask you this, and you've both forgotten, haven't you?
I did. But there is something. We've watched Reacher, but I'm not sure whether that should be allowed to disclose on air, but I love Reacher. He's supposed to
be a Christian, isn't he?
He is supposed to be a Christian. He had a massive debate about whether or not he should be playing such a portrayal of the character. But, Reacher. I love Reacher on Amazon.
What is it?
What is it? Well, it's based on a book series by a guy called Lee Child. And the guy is a guy called Jack Reacher, who used to be in the army. But he basically just wanders the USA, and wherever he goes, trouble finds him. And he just kind of, he is the law unto himself. So that's probably a good thing. He always
wins in fights.
Always wins.
He's like a comic character, really.
And he is a massive bloke. He's like 7 foot, big guy. That's the impression you get in the books. So when they brought the films out and they portrayed him as Tom Cruise...
is it Tom Cruise playing him?
In the films, and everyone's like, "Damn, this is just wrong." 5 foot something bloke, and we all know Richard's massive. But in the Amazon one, they've got this guy's just enormous.
Oh, okay. Oh, so it's had more than one iteration on screen.
There's 2 films, I think, and then there's the 2nd season on Amazon, and I love it.
Oh yeah, this is completely past me by.
I love the books as well.
Excellent. So is that like a wholehearted recommendation?
Oh, well, if you like that kind of thing, yeah.
Great.
It's action. Police.
Yeah.
It's a bit violent.
It's very relaxing because it's pretty predictable. It's not exactly like...
Oh, I quite like that, yeah.
It's not super intriguing.
Oh, no. It's just enjoyable.
But yeah, it's all right.
We watch it as a family. We love it.
Oh, nice.
I watched The Night Agent recently, which was good.
I've heard about this.
Yeah.
What is that?
It's a guy who's it's obviously a backstory, but he ends up in a sort of room where you answer this phone from what turns out to be agents that are sort of in distress. They phone this one kind of phone line, and then he gets embroiled in all this whole stuff that goes right the way to the top of the White House, pretty much.
I like the sound of that.
But it was good. Yeah, good little bit of intrigue. Watched something called Fool Me Once, which is on Netflix.
I'll tell you what I did enjoy. Yeah. Traitors.
People are talking about that, aren't they?
I've only watched bits of it. I think for cultural kind of understanding, I ought to watch more of it.
Genius.
To really get into it. But yeah, I just don't like reality TV. It just annoys me.
I do get that. But I really enjoyed Traitors. Really enjoyed it.
The sort of semi-falseness, the kind of the curating of a whole kind of experience of people into little segments that then kind of creates a story. I just don't like reality TV.
Yeah, but there is something
quite like that.
There's something about the dynamic and the way because of the way the game plays out and the false, the trust that you have to form but break as a traitor, and brilliant.
Yeah, I think I would like that. What channel is that on?
iPlayer, BBC.
Yeah.
It's finished.
You're a millennial, you won't have one.
I'm a millennial, can't watch that.
You're missing out.
What about you, Katie?
I've recently been enjoying the Junior Bake Off. I'm a different season of life to you two. Yeah. Although we didn't watch it till I know it finished, but then we started watching it after it finished. But we really got into that because one of the girls on it has celiac disease, which my daughter has and my husband. So she was quite into that. This girl's only a year older than her, and she's on this baking program, and she can't have gluten. And it was that was why we started watching it. But we've really got into it actually, and even my 5, nearly 6-year-old, probably 6 by the time it comes out, he went to a friend's house and he was like, no, you can't watch the next episode without me. And I was surprised that he was that into it. So that was good. So, yeah, great. Recommend that if you fancy something that's on Channel 4, catch up, whatever that's called these days. There we are. My enjoyment of that is self-evident. And today we are learning about God being self-existent. I was trying to think of a way I could segue into that and I couldn't. So, but we're on our attribute episode. I nearly said issue, but it's an episode, not an issue. So, God is self-existent. Graham, what does it mean when we say that God is self-existent?
I think, from what I can figure out, it's to do with the fact that God is not contingent, is not dependent on us for anything, and his existence doesn't owe itself to any other cause. It's a bit like saying God is eternal, but it's a slightly different emphasis because it's more an emphasis on the kind of the energy behind God, the power to exist comes from himself. And I think the best simple illustration of that is actually the burning bush. So that when God reveals his name, I am who I am, it has a kind of link with his eternity in that, because it's not sort of, I was and I am and I will be so much, although that's also true. But it's the fact that he always exists, and the fact that the bush doesn't burn up, in that there's this it's kind of symbolic of the fact that there's a kind of an endless bottomless pit, endless jug of energy that God has. So his ability to exist comes entirely from itself. I mean, we use the word sort of loosely, don't we? We say so-and-so is self-reliant. Yeah. As a character, to say that they don't particularly need people around them to kind of feel okay, or, they're a self-starter in that they can start doing projects. But that's not what we mean about God, that he's fairly well motivated, or that, he's got some of his own energy. Because all of us, when we say that about someone, ultimately we do derive that from someone else, or all kinds of life circumstances up to that point that have made us self-reliant. Whereas with God, there's nothing that's made him to be existing in the way he exists, because it just comes from himself, which is pretty mind-blowing. I think I've said everything there is to say about it now.
Well, but I think that's...
nothing left.
It's just making that distinction between... Therefore, he's not created in any way, is he? So we are created and dependent. He is uncreated and, not dependent on anything but himself. And that's the fundamental difference between us and God, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Uncaused as well, that phrase was used.
Our eternal life, just interestingly, I have to keep reminding myself this, that we're not eternal in the same sense that God is, and we're not. It's not as though God gives us, in a sense, the gift of self-existence in the new heavens and new earth.
Yeah.
From that point, we'll always be dependent on God for life in the new heavens and new earth, as much as we are now.
Yeah.
So it's not as though the immortality that we get translated into in the new heavens and new earth is a change in dependency, like we become like God in the sense of being kind of self-driven and energizing ourselves. We're still dependent on God for life. I know it's a slightly different point, but it's making the contrast.
Yeah, I've not really considered that, but you're right. And that's a good thing, isn't it? Like, because I don't want to stop relying on God when I'm in heaven.
No, and I think that you go back to the beginning, and so I'm getting really into this now, but you go back to the beginning and Adam and Eve, and I know it's a construct in a way to say, what if they hadn't have fallen? But I think we would have to sort of assume, on the basis of what God's word says in the first two chapters, that they would have continued to depend on God to provide for them, and would live in obedience and dependence on him, and their immortality was contingent on them being able to have access to the tree of life. And what we get in the new heavens and the new earth is unhindered access to the tree of life and a promise of God to be with us, but we're still dependent on him. Whereas God's not like that. So we can talk about God now, but after that little cul-de-sac or diversion or something.
It was a good one. It's worth saying probably as well, like all of his attributes, they all apply to each other. So with God's self-existence, actually he's independent in his being, but also in his virtues, in his decrees and his works and everything. God is, he doesn't rely on anything or anyone for any of it. It just cropped up when I was reading, and I thought, oh yeah, that is like his goodness. Like when we were talking about that everything was good about him, not just one thing.
Yeah. And it's a good answer when people talk about who made God.
Yeah.
But it is a hard thing to get your head around. Children ask it, adults ask it. They're always the same question about who made God. And it's to do with the self-existence is part of the answer, to say this is a category error because no one could make God, because God is unmade by definition.
Yeah.
He is self-existent. But it is part of that answer, which is mind-blowing, because there's nothing in all of creation that isn't caused by something else, or that doesn't exist dependent, contingent on something or someone or some other cause.
Yeah, because absolutely everything else was caused or made.
Yeah.
Which, God is the only thing. Category all of his own. So how and where do we see God's self-existence in Scripture? You talked about the burning bush. Are there other places? Must be Mark's turn.
He gets the hard question.
He's sitting there.
Well, I mean, obviously you see it in one sense, I guess, in his name, I am who I am.
Yeah.
There's a sense there that he's decreeing, I am who I am, what I am, dependent. I mean, I think you see it in obviously in Jesus coming, when he talks about John 1, that he is the life, and that life comes from him. And the reason life comes from him is because he is self-existent. He is the holder of life.
Yeah. So in the beginning was the Word as well.
And exactly, who is divine and self-existent in himself. That obviously throws up questions about the Trinity and the relationship and how that works. But there is that sense of life being from Christ and from him alone. Hence why it's so shocking, especially when you get John 1, where you see that rejection of the Creator, the one who has life, because somehow we think we don't need him, and yet we are dependent on him for every breath.
Yeah. I was thinking about the creation narrative as well, where we just see, I mean, we've already touched on it, but just to say it, like God was there. Cool. Like there wasn't, God just spoke and he made everything, but God was there before that. He just was, which is probably obvious, but worth stating because it's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it feeds into, as you already said, his other attributes. So we see it in the fact that he talks about his eternity, and why is it that he existed from everlasting to everlasting? Well, because he is self-existent. He didn't depend on anything in eternity past, and he will not depend on anything in eternity future. And actually, why is he sovereign overall, and why is he beyond question? Because there is nothing and no one that is his equal. So we see it kind of feeds into all the other attributes which are unique about God, and that God displays for his glory and talks about in contrast to all other made-up gods or all human beings. That he's independent in a true sense. Yeah,
great. What are some of the implications of God being self-existent then, in terms of how that kind of plays out in Scripture, but also like in our lives now? Like what does that mean for us that God is self-existent?
Well, Graham's just touched on something, isn't it, particularly in terms of his sovereignty, his rule. Yeah. So if you're self-existent, you're not dependent on anyone. You determine all things, including time. I mean, that's the other thing. So I think sometimes we get caught up, but God sits outside of time because he creates time, and that's part of his self-existence. There wasn't a point where he didn't exist. He always existed because there wasn't anything where there was a time-bound thing. So things like just how we therefore sit and understand his sovereignty, but it also goes into what we've been talking about, our dependence and our need of him for life, spiritual, physical, in the ways in which that then kind of plays out day by day. Would be some.
Yeah. Any more, Graham?
I always think with all his attributes that you can either turn them into a fearful thing, or you can turn them into a thing that helps you worship him and trust him more, which hopefully is what you do. And it is a kind of an awesome, overwhelming thing to think of a non-dependent being, but it means I can have confidence that there is the possibility, at least, of heaven for anyone, because this is a God with exhaustless. No, that's not the word, is it? Anyway, inexhaustible. That's the word I'm looking for. Inexhaustible supplies. So those kind of weirdly conceptual things, like, how can God be everywhere, or do everything, or provide for everyone, or how can God kind of provide the energy? Because we're always thinking about kind of energy running out. How can God provide the energy for an eternity of experience in the new heavens and new earth? Or because he's self-existent. So, and who does God have to consult with about that? No one. What primary supplier does have to keep supplying something, water, energy, light, in order that it keeps going? No one, because God supplies it, and how exhaustible are his supplies? They're not. So it does give me confidence at a, there are other good reasons for being in the new heavens and new earth, but at a kind of conceptual level, it just kind of gives you solid trust, because God is self-existent. You can really rely that eternity is going to work.
Yeah.
But also just in the sense of thinking about, imagine worshipping a God who was created.
Yeah.
It then throws up other questions. Well, then who created? So is he the real power, or is he not the real power? In order to be the defining power, you have to be self-existent, don't you? Otherwise, you are created by something, or you just randomly combust. I think the doctrine that, to not hold this doctrine throws you far bigger questions in terms of, therefore, what is God? Who is God? A created being, a created thing, but actually a being who is self-existent, who has always existed. Well, that makes sense if you then are the creator of the universe, who rules and sovereign and in power. There's no greater, which then, as Graham was saying, in terms of that, then categorizes my worship. That is right then that I worship the one who is such, because there is no greater, which is why the Lord is then concerned with his own glory, because there is no greater thing than his own glory, because there is no greater being than him.
Yeah. It's quite a scary thought if you don't believe this, because either there is, as you say, like someone who created God, so there's someone higher who could one day just stop it all, or take God's power, or just undo everything, or it's random and chance or chaos, in which case, it could all just randomly stop, explode, whatever, implode, whatever kind of plode you like it's, it could just plode one way or the other.
Exactly.
But that's not the case. Yeah. But this is the only way, I guess, that like the Bible shows us, doesn't it? This is the only way that we can continue and have eternity. And that's why God does use it in contrasting with the gods that are nothing. So when Isaiah is and others given images about idols and the fact that they burn up, or they're made of wood, or all those things are to show the finiteness. I'm struggling with my words, aren't I? But finitude? Is that a thing?
I don't know. That feels more like a final thing.
Finite's right.
Yeah,
they are finite.
Right. It's but how do you describe something? Well, suppose you just describe it as finite.
Yeah.
But the property of being finite is the finiteness of gods. So it's a lump of wood, and a lump of wood burns up, and so there's often contrast between the gods that are either powerless or temporary or temporal. They're caught in time and space, and they can be tamed and controlled, and God is beyond that.
Yeah. And that's the issue with worshipping nature, or finding God in nature, isn't it? Because actually this doctrine and the Bible makes it clear that God is distinct from creation. We can't go and worship a tree and say, well, I'm worshipping God, because no, the tree was created by God. God is not created.
Yeah, and Tim Keller, when the late Tim Keller, when he was writing The Counterfeit Gods, which is a kind of seminal book on the kind of bringing back idolatry into the dialogue, and he was really good in showing not just that idolatry was wrong, and not even so much that it was stupid, but that it ends up being unsatisfying because it's not God, and because those things end up enslaving you, because they're just as much, whether it's a religion or something kind of inanimate, it sucks the life out of you because it absorbs your worship, but it has nothing to give. It can only take, because it is even in a theoretical sense, it's a consumer. It's not a giver, whereas God is a giver, and God gives from His own self-existence. So it really helps us contrast with idols, and as Christians, kind of wanting to return to idolatry, it helps us put it in its place and think, this thing that I'm putting before God, it's finite, it's dependent, it's contingent, it's temporary, it's not going to last very long. Yeah. And so why would I possibly put my trust in this thing when I really think about it? Because it doesn't have this property of being self-perpetuating, and it will only take from me. It may give me something, but ultimately it'll only take from me.
Yeah. And then another level of it as well is that because God is the one who made everything, He's the one who controls it, and He owns everything, and He can do what He likes with everything. Which is, this is stuff I was reading when I was prepping this. This is not my insightful thoughts, but it did make me think, actually, we don't, God doesn't owe us anything, which is, we sometimes can slip into that attitude, I think, that, that God's doing it wrong. When, if something happens that we don't like, that He's somehow, doing it wrong. But no, God made everything. He knows what He's doing, and he can do what He likes with it. He doesn't owe us a mansion or a Tesla. It's one of you wanted one of those, didn't you, at some point?
It's on my Christmas list still.
Yeah, it was on your. I feel like it was mentioned at some point.
Still there.
Can we tease that out a bit? Like, what does that? How does that impact us? The fact that God is the one who owns everything.
Well, I think it kind of moves into, doesn't it, where we're talking about Him as creator. It moves back to what we adore, what we worship. It moves back into trusting Him, that His purposes, His plans, particularly in the ways of salvation, but particularly also in the ways of what He commands. And it's remembering that, in that sense, it's the creator divide. So therefore, I am looking to Him and trusting His good purposes and trusting who He is, knowing that He is the one who knows and holds all things to be true and good and right. So, it helps me when I'm kind of feeling anxious or worried, because actually I can trust that He does know all things and He has got all things. But it also helps me when I'm feeling proud, because it humbles me to think, actually, I know nothing compared to Him who is the creator, the self-existent one. But it also goes back to the reality as well. The Psalms talk about, He's also compassionate on us. He knows that we're sand. He knows that we are but, like the grass that's cut and blown away. He knows that about us, and therefore He is compassionate and kind of merciful to us as the one who is self-existent. So you kind of, these are how the great truths of these doctrines are. We don't believe in a God who is just this kind of distant monster in the air, or just a transcendent being. He is immanent. He's close with. He walked with. He entered our world, but He also, has compassion. He's merciful. He's gracious. But He's also the one who is in control of all things. Therefore, He is ultimately the judge, because He's the one who sees all things and knows all things. Therefore, I need to respond in all those ways. And I'm holding those things in tension. He isn't just the judge. He is, but He's also compassionate and gracious and merciful to us.
That was so encouraging when we did do that episode on goodness, to remember that in His self-existence, for instance, He's good in it. So we don't, in His power, I don't think we've done omnipotent yet, but we'll get there. But in that, He's good in it. in it.
Yeah, I was going to make that joke, but you spoiled it now.
Oh, sorry.
He's good in it. He's good in it.
We can, we'll get Sam to edit that and make it sound like you did it, and it'll be funny. That's not going to happen. So, yeah, we have touched on this now, but this is an incommunicable attribute of God, which means that, wrap my head around it, it's not an attribute that we share. So we are not self-existent. We are existent. Or we're reliant on God. He made us. We're reliant on Him. What happens when we forget that? When we start to forget that we're not self-existent and God is?
It's the essence of pride, isn't it? And what happens is we stop depending on God, and we stop wanting to worship God, and as I was saying earlier, we worship other things when we forget it. We also lose our hope, and we lose our joy, because it's pretty joyless depending on yourself, because you're so unreliable. It's not as though you're unreliable in your character. You're morally unreliable, but you're also physically unreliable. You can't always repeat a brilliant fitness challenge, and you don't generally in life get better and better. You kind of peak and you get worse and worse physically. So we are it's a very joyless existence if you're depending on yourself intellectually, morally, physically, financially. Even if people earn lots of money and can be self-reliant in that sense, but it's not a very reliable source. By the writer of the book Ecclesiastes.
Yeah, but you're exhausted, aren't you? That's the other thing. You never rest because you can't ever truly rest, because you've got to keep fighting. You'd become anxious, fearful. You become, alongside the pride of all of those kind of things. But you also end up becoming a messiah complex, that you think you can save everything, save everyone in your sphere. All of those things just begin to creep out when you forget. Actually you're a creature, not the creator.
Yeah, you're right. I think as a mum, this is something I hadn't realised that I'd do, but reading this, I'm like, oh, that is why. I think because you've got so many people who are reliant on you, with, keeping the house together, making the packed lunches, all of that you can forget that actually, if I stop doing this, one, they wouldn't have packed lunch, but that's about it. Like God is self-existent. Like I'm not. It's not me who has to kind of do everything. If I miss one Bible time with my kids, that's not going to be the thing that makes them not be Christians. It's God, isn't it? If we have,
it's certainly true.
Pizza for dinner every night for 1 week, it's not actually going to kill them.
No. You may be able to kill them by diet in one sense, but you probably have to work a bit harder than that.
Yeah, which defeats the point, I
Let's
suppose.
not go there.
So, no, let's not. And I guess the other thing is that we can start to think that God needs us. I think when, especially kind of busy Christians or people in ministry, but again, maybe just parents as well, like, oh, God needs me to do this. If I don't do X, Y, or Z, His kingdom won't grow. These people will never hear the gospel. And I just think it's really helpful to remember that God is He doesn't need us. If that's not to say we shouldn't serve and shouldn't evangelize, but His purposes are
but
above ours.
It's the over responsibility, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I am responsible to share the faith. I am responsible to lead my children, teach the Bible, but it's when it shifts into over responsibility that I think it's all on me, and that's where I start becoming proud or anxious or fearful. And over responsibility, we see it often because we forget actually God's got this, and I think it's all down to me. Over responsibility in the preach. I think if I get this sermon wrong, everything's going horribly wrong in the lot, but it's not true. I've got a responsibility to be faithful and do what I can, but in the end, the Lord will rule over these things.
He will. As we finish then, why is it good news that God is self-existent?
Because it means He's God and I'm not.
Yeah. That is good, isn't it? Like when I'm feeling proud, I guess I do want to be God, but most of the time I think I'm glad I'm not. As is everybody else, I think. Not least my family.
Yeah, he gives us little bits of life to be sovereign over, but it's always a dependent sovereignty. I think it gives us a big view of God. One of my little relatives said something like, "Why does God need us?" And it was a really good question. But we don't offer the gospel in the sense that here's this lonely God, and he'd really like to be friends with you. Do you want to be friends with him? It's the awesome God, who made you and who doesn't actually need you, but he's reaching out in love to offer you forgiveness and relationship. But you've got to have a big view of God to feel the kind of weight of that and the bigness of his stooping grace to send his son and to enter a world of dependence for that period in order to redeem us. But it's not because God's lonely. God was complete and content, self-existent, not just in terms of energy, but in terms of relationship and everything else.
Because of the Trinity.
Gives us yes, indeed, and it gives us a big view of God, and the bigger view of God, the better.
That's a good note to end on. We will see you next time. You've been listening to Ordinary, the podcast seeking to help ordinary Christians live for Christ in everyday life. If you found this helpful, please do share with a friend. Come and find us on social media. We'd love to have you join our conversations. You can find us on Twitter @OrdinaryCCHH, on Instagram @OfficialOrdinaryPodcast, and on YouTube @OrdPod, that's ORDPOD. Or you can email your comments or questions to ordinary@cchh.org.uk. We'll see you next time.